What do Americans need to know about the South in order to understand America? Imani Perry will be here to talk about her latest book, South to America. How did we come to play the games we all love and sometimes hate? Oliver Roeder will join us to talk about his debut book, 7 Games, A Human History. Alexandra Alter will be here to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us to talk about the books they've been reading and reviewing. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's January 28th. I'm Pamela Paul. Imani Perry joins us now from outside Philadelphia. She is the Hughes Roger Professor of African American Studies at Princeton, where she also teaches gender and sexuality studies, and the author of several books. Her most recent is called South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon Line to Understand the Soul of a Nation. Imani, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So this new book is a little hard to describe because it kind of occupies several different genres. And rather than me try to describe it, I want to pass it over to you. How do you think about the book in terms of what genres you're working within and your inspiration?
I guess the most immediate precedent for the book would be Albert Murray's 1971 South to a Very Old Place, which there's this over 100-year-old tradition of people writing books that are journeys through the South. But what Murray did and what really inspired me is he went back to his homeland. He had moved up north. He went back home and tried to understand both how it had changed. You know, this is like immediately post-civil rights movement South, and also the way it had remained the same. What are the central tensions, points of importance and difficulty in the origin? And in some ways, I'm doing the same kind of thing so that it includes personal stories. It is a book about encounters. It is a book about the encounter with history, but also with human beings. And as part of it, self-discovery to try to understand why a Southern identity is so centrally important to me, and why it's so centrally important to the formation of this country.
Let's stay on Albert Murray for just a moment. Can you talk a little bit more about who he is and what that book ended up being and how it was received at the time? And what about it struck you that you wanted to turn to it for inspiration or as a model?
Albert Murray was this extraordinary native Alabaman who has a career in the military and becomes, in his later life, really in his 50s, just an incredible critic based in New York who writes about blues, who writes fiction, who writes about jazz. He's this sort of seer of American culture and understanding the centrality of African American life and American culture. And there's a review of South to the Very Old Place that is sort of also undercurrent in the book that was written by Toni Morrison. And it's a mixed review. It's a recognition that he really gets to the zeitgeist of the country. And also, Murray is very invested in understanding how deeply, intimately connected Black and white Americans are, particularly in the South. Morrison pushes him to think about the diaspora, so I sort of try to answer that push as well. But I'll also say, Murray was born in Alabama in 1916. My grandmother was born in Alabama in 1917. There's something about the gaze of that generation that came through Jim Crow, witnesses the transformation, and also the ways in which the transformation of the society wasn't complete, that has always been part of how I have seen the world because I was so close to my grandmother. So getting his voice as a critic has been really central to my own development, to see transformation, but also, as Baraka put it, the changing same in the society around race in particular.
So you were also born in Alabama, correct? But
I was.
You grew up mostly outside the South. Before we get to your own story, let's talk about your grandmother and what her childhood was like growing up during that same period that Murray grew up in Alabama.
So my grandmother, who is probably the single most important intellectual influence in my mouth, in my life, although my mother is also a scholar, was born in the rural South on a farm that her family owned. So grew up sort of relatively prosperous, but had 12 children, and then adulthood in which she was a domestic laborer and at times stayed at home and raised 12 children, sent them all to college from Birmingham in particular, which was known as the most racist city in the country, and was a voracious reader, was a person who was deeply politically engaged, and also was a person who occupied, by many accounts, the lowest rung of the social order, and yet had incredible dignity and grace. And so the frame of reference of her life is always on my shoulder, as it were, to think about how do we, read through the layers of the society, read from the bottom, but also acknowledge that at the bottom there are incredible, insightful, curious people to listen to.
You said that she was an intellectual influence. It's an interesting choice of words. In what way?
She had strong opinions always. And she would say, she had to have something to read every day. So she would talk about how the newspaper was so expensive. She said, the paper is so high, but I have to have something to read every day. Just this curiosity and also a sense of entitlement in the world. So if something was going wrong in the neighborhood, she was going to write a letter to the mayor or, call a representative's office. And so she was curious, but also wanted to know in order to act, right? And so that disposition, and also she was critical. So I remember one time she was talking to a doctor who was dismissive, and she said, I know you don't care nothing about me because I'm old and Black. That critical disposition to understand that she was not, going to be the recipient of quality of care because of the position she occupied. For me, that's the origin point of sort of wanting to think about how inequality operates, right? So I listened to her. I stood behind her when she would sit at the dining table, and I pushed my elbow my cousins away because I wanted to be right behind her and understand how she saw things.
Your family is from Alabama, though you mostly grew up outside the South. In what ways has the South shaped and defined you personally?
I was born in the South, and before I left, I was walking, talking, reading, writing, and dancing. And so I've been thinking about other examples of people who similarly conceive of the region as home. Sonia Sanchez is a perfect example. She also left Birmingham at a young age. And her grandmother is also a primary muse for her. Romare Bearden, the artist, left North Carolina at a young age and describes it as a place that he only ever left physically, because by the time you acquire those skills, right, ways of seeing and doing, the sensorium, the rhythms, the landscape, it's already in you. And so you have become someone by that point, at least for me. And I also returned. When we moved to Massachusetts, I never spent a summer in Massachusetts until adulthood. And so I was going, and I was also in Chicago, but this consistent return is a part of it. And also, and this is really important, I don't come from a great migration family. My family is still overwhelmingly in the South. So that's where, as we say, my people are. So it's always been home.
That's a really interesting distinction. I mean, in what ways does a family that lives in the North, or a person who lives in the North, but whose family was not part of that great migration, whose family is still in the South, how does that change your perspective and your sense of identity?
I mean, I think it's that it remains your home base, a place where you can always go, irrespective of what tragedies might occur, where there are people who love you, where the core sounds and senses are. It's interesting. People don't often talk about migrants as being similar to immigrants, but I think it's very analogous to people who come from immigrant families but are the only ones who come to the U.S., and how much they retain not just a sense of identity with the home country, but also language, right, and sensibility. And so I do think it's quite different than if your entire family reconstitutes itself in another region. We have never left the site, the state where our ancestors were enslaved, where they fought the civil rights struggle. We stayed, as it were, and fought on the grounds. And so it just is such a core part of my identity. And I feel actually incredibly grateful to have been born there. 9 years after the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, 7 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. That's the world I was born into.
You often will hear people say, the South belongs to us. The South belongs to us just as much as to anyone else. We had Sean Cosby on the podcast a few months ago, and he was saying that the South is a place that fundamentally belongs to Black Americans in the same way that it belongs to anyone else. There's no ceding of any ground or sense of belonging there.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's important. We've had really extraordinarily beautiful accounts of the Great Migration, particularly from Isabel Wilkerson in recent history. And so in some ways, this is sort of a companion to that. The majority of African Americans have always lived in the South, even to this day, over 50%. And so, and I think part of the confusion about the significance of that comes from actually the Electoral College map and the recent red state and blue state idea, which is, of course, rooted in the history of Southern politics and the way Southern politics shaped the country. But, to talk about a red state gives a misperception that, the entire nation is perhaps shades of purple. And there are incredibly blue counties, and those places have been sites of contestation since the very formation, right? So if we characterize the South as not Black, right, as much as it is white, you actually miss not just what it is, but actually how it transformed this country. The Civil Rights Revolution, it transformed other regions, but also had an impact on the world. That's the Black South. It's an incredible legacy.
Is there a sense of tension, too, of personal tension between this feeling when you go back to the South of this is home, this is family, there's a sense of belonging, and then the political reality and the more intellectual reaction to the South and the way in which it operates for Black people in particular?
Honestly, no, partially because I live in Pennsylvania, which is a battleground state, right? So I've actually been writing and talking about this part for my entire life. When we moved north and moved to Boston, that's where I experienced the most virulent racism of my life. That's where I experienced bottles thrown at the car and racial slurs. It was right after the busing crisis in Boston. So for me, the experience of racial violence is not actually regional at all. What I feel more connected to in the South is actually sort of a kind of experience of resilience that you're socialized into from the very beginning and a resistant disposition. So I actually feel bolstered in the South in terms of what it means to be a Black person in this country in ways that feel much stronger to me. And also, at the same time, I have a critique, obviously a strong critique of the way people who work are treated in the South, the way the exploitation, which is racialized, but it's also cuts across class lines and immigration status lines as well.
We'll talk a little bit more about that and about how that figures into this book, South to America.
One of the things that I've tried to do in the book is to offer a portrait of the relations of working people, those who are wealthy, those who are exploited, and the land around, so that there are Souths plural in part because there are different land formations. So if I hone in on one place, chicken plants, right, chicken factories, which once were, so talk about them in Mississippi and the horrific work conditions that were once occupied largely by African Americans and are now occupied largely by Mexican and Central American people. But that the relation is the same because it has always depended upon people who cannot exert much in the way of rights, right? They're incredibly vulnerable laborers. And I also try at the same time to complicate the notion of this being a different issue because of immigration, because I describe the cycles of migration through the South, through the Caribbean and Latin America that have gone back hundreds of years. So that's actually one region. We have different borders now, but the places that Europe competed for, because there was so much abundance and prosperity, have always been places that indigenous people, African people have been moved around, and also poor and working class white people. And so part of the story is about the social relations that might have different parties at different times, but that are really key and often a tragic part of the story of this nation, that it has been a place where it's okay to move people in and out and grind down their lives to barely anything. So the core for me is to think about, well, how do we look at this region, understand this history, and maybe get closer to imagining a different kind of set of social relations that we might have.
You also argue that the South as a region and as a culture is intrinsic to what it is to be considered American.
Absolutely. On one level, it's shown in our tastes. American music that is so powerful for its ability to both depict anguish and hope. It's all of it. Virtually every genre is rooted in the South because it's a place of vulnerability and also dreaming. Our tastes for, obviously, for sugar, the drive to have some palliative, and that has to do with the cultivation of sugar, of course, in the South, but also what it means to be a hardworking person. You know, the Walmartification of American business, the vulnerability of workers. I don't think it's incidental that in some ways has been a vanguard for labor relations. You know, there's so much of the way we do things, including, of course, our politics, where we've been talking about the filibuster recently, Mitch McConnell drawing the distinction between African American voters and Americans recently, right? That's not just sort of happenstance, you know, and one of the things that I talk about in the book is an ancestor who was born in Maryland in 1769 and thinking about what it must have been for an enslaved girl, really, at that time to witness the formation, the creation of a nation where she was laboring, where she had been brought and not being contemplated as a citizen. That idea is really potent and also significant for what we are. We have always had people in our midst who are treated as though they don't count. And so we look to that. I mean, it's a particularly Southern legacy, not because the South is distinctly bad, but because, one, that's where the nation begins, really in its formation, and two, because that's where the prosperity of the nation was developed. That wealth that allows the U.S. to become a global power is predicated, it's based on what it meant to have unfree laborers in your midst.
One of the things you do in the book is you just mentioned one of your ancestors and you talk about people in your own family, but also other figures in history who may be lesser known, that don't appear as frequently in our history books. We don't have time to talk about all of them. So let's just talk about one who's very early in your book, Shields Green. Who is he?
Shields Green is one of the men who had joined John Brown's raid, a Black man, and his nickname was Emperor. Part of why I'm so fascinated by him is that he has this sort of fragmented story, and the details about him reveal a good deal about how he was seen. You know, Frederick Douglass talked about his speech impediment. There is this description of him as having been very illiterate and very Black, and that he was disturbing because he was so, quote unquote, Black, and also had this incredible dignity and self-possession, and joined John Brown's raid and was killed and then was dissected, essentially. And so his body becomes this figure in history, even though his story is relatively incomplete. And among the people who he took hostage were relatives of Jefferson. And so here's this historical figure who is not really recounted fully. He's just engaged with suggestively, but he's obviously at the crossroads of history. So he was an example and also a way to think about how do you engage with that which hasn't been preserved carefully, the sort of the incomplete puzzle, as it were. One of the things people often talk about is that in African American genealogy is the Wall of 1870. Because before 1870, slave registers didn't mention names. And people say, oh, you know, it was because enslaved people weren't considered human. But if you look at runaway notices, it becomes very clear that that's not true. They are remarkably detailed. You know, they'll talk about scars and height and texture of hair and body shape. enslaved people were known intimately, were recognized as humans. So the decision not to record them is actually a much more aggressive act than just disregard or considering them not human. It's actually a statement that we are not counting you, not that you aren't present. And I think for me, that is a really important historical lesson. It's easier to say, oh, well, people of their time, they just didn't think this was important or that was important. No, they did recognize humans in their midst, whether they're indigenous or African in origin, and made a decision to discount them. And we need that lesson because we are always confronted with the issue of who we are discounting, whether it's, people who live on the street or people who are in detention. Understanding that root, I think, is important for raising the serious ethical questions. And that's the debate I would love for us to be able to have with young people, to have that conversation.
Well, they would do well to start here with your book. The title, again, is South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. And it's by Imani Perry. Imani, thank you so much again for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Oliver Roeder joins us now. He is formerly a senior writer at 538 and the editor of their collection of math puzzles, The Riddler. And his new book is called 7 Games, A Human History. Oliver, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, I want to start with that subtitle because it's a human history instead of a history of the games. That's an interesting distinction. And elsewhere, you describe the book as a group biography. So what do you mean by that?
So it's a human history because games are incredibly important. They're an incredibly important part of human history. We find them in ancient relics of humankind, and we find them played by millions of people around the world today. The same games that were played in ancient cities are now played by supercomputers, and games are sort of this through line for millennia. It's a group biography of 7 games chosen for a variety of reasons. One is I think these games will be pretty familiar to most readers, games like checkers and chess and backgammon and poker. And these games have very active subcultures, are played by very interesting characters, and have received a lot of attention from researchers, often computer scientists wanting to use these games as test beds for artificial intelligence.
All right, we will get to the artificial intelligence and the computer side of things later because that's a whole other question to my mind. I want to talk about the human part first. What is it about games that attracts people? Why do we play them?
It's a great question. I think the answer is a constellation of things. The simplest answer is they're fun. We enjoy playing them as a pastime. Another answer is their practice. Games are very simplified, distilled models of the real world in which we live. So, for example, a game like poker allows us to practice dealing with uncertainty and hidden information. We don't know our opponent's cards. And of course, we see situations like that in real life all the time. A game like chess allows us to practice, say, planning and strategy and tactics. And games are just very distilled models of a dauntingly complex real world beyond our kitchen table. And yet another reason is games are a certain art form, just like painting captures the visual world or music captures the heard world. Games capture agency, this idea of deciding and acting. And we enjoy games as a form of art appreciation, and games are unique in that they capture agency as their subject.
So you mentioned earlier that games are practice. And last night I was watching a nature documentary with one of my kids. And of course, you always have scenes where predators are playing together, but we are to understand that that's really practice for hunting and attacking and killing one's prey. And so it's interesting to me, too, to think of games as practice. Practice for what? Because games are very competitive.
There's a theory that's often trotted out to sort of explain this practice idea, and it's very similar to what you just mentioned. I mean, imagine you're an early human and you need to hunt to gather food, and you could either hunt all the time, but this is incredibly dangerous, or you could never hunt, in which case you don't get any good at it. But you could invent a game. You could say, let's throw rocks at that tree over there, and we become good at throwing rocks and our aim improves, and it's sort of safe exactly because we've invented this game. Modern games in modern board and card games obviously have much less violent subtext, but I think the practice, take an example, one of my favorite games is Scrabble. And a key component of Scrabble strategy is the trade-off between today and tomorrow. That is between scoring points on this turn and saving good tiles to do something even better next turn. This idea of sort of being kind to your future self. And I played far, far too much Scrabble in grad school, but I do genuinely believe that I learned lessons from this game, lessons about saving and planning for tomorrow and these sort of intertemporal trade-offs. And I think you can take lessons learned from seemingly frivolous pastimes that we call games and take them into the real world. I think the border between the game board and the real world is a porous one.
There have been a number of books and articles in recent years about video games and the benefits of video games. And the video games teach all kinds of skills and ways of thinking that are helpful to people in the long run. In short, that perhaps grown-ups shouldn't worry about kids playing so many video games, and maybe also that grown-ups shouldn't worry about grown-ups playing so many video games. And the games you're talking about are not video games. I'm curious if you think there's something fundamentally different to the games that you're describing in this book, which you mentioned a few of them earlier. Maybe just run through the 7 very quickly so we know what we're talking about.
Sure. The 7 are checkers, chess, Go, backgammon, poker, Scrabble, and bridge. And I believe I listed them in the order in which their chapters appear in the book. No, I don't think there's any essential difference between the board and card games that I talk about in the book and video games. And I mentioned video games here and there in the book. And I wholeheartedly agree with the research and the notion that suggests that video games are valuable. I strongly believe that. And of course, I think the same about board and card games too. And one example of why I don't think there's a meaningful distinction here is if we take a look at sort of the modern game of chess, this game that's 1,500, 2,000 years old, chess today has become a wildly popular esport, essentially. There's a very active streaming community, chess streamers on Twitch and YouTube. Chess is having unprecedented boom in popularity, driven in part by the Queen's Gambit, the Netflix show, driven in part, of course, by the pandemic and the gaming time that it provided. But chess, in a lot of ways, is indistinguishable from a video game. It has moved very much online.
Yes, chess.com is a frequently used program in this household. But another distinction that I think is interesting, and the games you look at have a combination of these, are games of skill versus games of chance, and games in which they both have a role. So chess and Go, I think, are purely games of skill, right? There's no chance involved.
That's right.
What about the other games that you describe, and what differentiates? Is that a useful way in which to think about games and dividing them between those that are purely chance, those that are purely skill, and those that are somewhere in between?
Yeah, it's absolutely useful. And in a lot of ways, for research about these games, it's a critical distinction. I would say I think some of the best games and some of my favorite games are very potent mixtures of skill and chance. So
Like Scrabble.
like Scrabble, exactly, or like poker, undeniably a game of skill, or like backgammon, my latest obsession. I had never played much backgammon before reporting this book, and I am a serial obsessive. That's Serial, not Cereal. And my latest obsession is backgammon, which I think is the absolute perfect mixture of luck and skill. And I think one attractive symptom of having luck in a game is that it's very easy to get people to play because they always have a chance. It would be very, very difficult, say, for a chess master to play against a beginner. No one would have any fun. But two people of any skill level can play backgammon and have a great time. So I feel like some injection of luck is a very attractive feature of games. And indeed, the oldest games we find, the most ancient games, are often games of chance. But I would just say that games of chance can have enormous components of skill as well.
Let's talk about the origins of some of these games. Since you mentioned backgammon, it started in ancient Egypt. What do we know about how the game began and how it developed and became popular?
Well, given the ancient nature of a few of the games, the ancient genesis of a few of the games I talk about in the book, the history gets very muddled and complicated. And, we can't identify a single inventor of any of these games. But the most important thing to know is that we find games everywhere. I tell a story in the backgammon chapter about Egyptologists in the early 20th century sort of smashing into these burial tombs in Lower Nubia and finding pristine copies of backgammon, almost indistinguishable from the game we play today. And it appears that games had a number of uses in the ancient world. Again, I think the most simple explanation is that they were fun. And the philologist Irving Finkel has a great quote about the ancient world, which a lot of the times there was bugger all to do. And games are a very attractive way to fill this time. But even in ancient times, games served as theaters for gambling, as they do today. And occasionally there was sort of a mystical component. Games of chance were seen as objects of divination or fortune telling, depending on the way the dice or the sheep knuckle bones, as they used, fell.
You mentioned gambling, and obviously there's a lot of competition involved in these games. We often talk about chess as being one of the most highly competitive games. And the recent popularity of the Queen's Gambit, obviously, it's played a part, at least in the last couple of years. But there's major competition in all of these games. There was recently a scandal with people cheating at bridge.
Yeah, bridge cheating is sort of endemic to the game, it seems. And the bridge is interesting. It's the last chapter of the book, and in some ways, it stands alone from a lot of the other games. It has a much more modern history than a lot of the games, and it's a game played in partnerships, so 2-on-2, essentially. And the key to bridge, or one of the many keys to bridge, but an important one, is communicating information to your partner about the cards you hold in your hand. And you're only allowed to do this in bridge in very, very specific ways, i.e. via an auction that occurs at the beginning of a bridge hand. And communicating in any other way, coughing, nudging your partner beneath the table, whatever, is bridge's mortal sin. So, of course, this is what people try to do. And they try to get away with it through a variety of signaling mechanisms. I think it's interesting. I think it speaks to the ingenuity of humans and that we're willing to find ways to communicate with one another, and also to a sort of inevitability of corruption if given the chance. There's a bit of a cheating problem ongoing in bridge and increasingly sophisticated methods to try to suss it out.
All right, we have to get to computers, but first, before we get there, let's talk about Marion Tinsley, who is a human being and apparently the greatest checkers player.
And what a human being he was. Marion Tinsley was a mathematician, an evangelical minister, and the greatest checkers player the world has ever known. I might go further and say he's the greatest competitor in any game or sport that the world has ever seen. Over a 40-year stretch of competitive checkers tournament play involving over 1,000 games, he lost exactly 3 times.
Wow. What went wrong on those occasions?
I'm a huge Tinsley admirer, but even I can forgive 3 out of 1,000. And he was, I think like many, if not all great games players, just a true obsessive. And he lived and breathed 2 things, and that was the Bible and checkers. And in his mind, these often appeared to be indistinguishable. Great checkers ideas, great checkers moves would come to him out of the clear blue sky, he said, just like his insights into scripture. And he became the target, I think it's fair to say, of a major computer science / artificial intelligence research project.
To see if a computer could beat him.
Exactly right. So a man named Jonathan Schafer, who was and is a computer scientist at the University of Alberta, devoted his professional life to checkers as well, but in a rather different way. So Professor Schafer's goal was to make a computer program that could play checkers better than any human, could play at a superhuman level. And today, to the modern listener, that might sound a little silly, right? Checkers is sort of seen as this simple child's game. But in fact, checkers is incredibly complicated and an incredibly deep game. And 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the hardware was at a level of power that checkers was a very suitable match for the computer. So Jonathan Schafer's program was called Chinook, named after a wind that blows through Canada. And his life and Tinsley's life, they were sort of locked in this mortal battle. And one point that I'm careful to make in the book, and I'd like to make here, is oftentimes these sort of AI versus human matches are pitched as sort of, man versus machine, human versus machine. But in fact, there is no such thing because, of course, a human built the machine. And these matches are human versus human, just human in 2 different roles. And so Tinsley, the great human player, and Schafer, the great human programmer, were locked in this battle. And Schafer faced a race against time because Marion Tinsley was growing old. And essentially, Schafer wanted to prove to the world that he could beat the great human Tinsley before the great human Tinsley did what every human does, which is die.
Okay, we don't have time to talk about all of these games, and I'm especially disappointed that we can't talk about Go and how horribly frustrating it is for those of us who play it really poorly. But what is the obsession with creating computer programs that can beat humans? I mean, why do we care? Why is that the goal?
That's a great question. And again, I think there's a number of answers. I think what a computer scientist would tell you is games are test beds. Games, just like for humans, for computers, games are simplified models of the real world. And one thing that computer scientists and especially developers of AI want to do is to create systems that impact the real world. And one very attractive starting point is games. Games have features you find in the real world of planning and of interpretation and of pattern recognition and all these things. That's one reason. Another reason games are attractive is because how a computer does is very measurable. So you can have a computer play a game and you can see, well, my computer won or my computer lost. And this sort of measurement would be a lot more difficult, say, if you had a computer write a paragraph, right? It's much more difficult. Is this paragraph good or bad? So games are very, very measurable. And I think, if I'm perfectly honest, games are also fun for computer programmers. They're a fun thing to work on. Like imagine your day job being, well, I teach computers to play chess all day. I would be very, very happy if that was my day job. But essentially, games are a very, very useful domain for machines, just like they're a very, very useful domain for human players.
One last quick question. There's one game that computers haven't figured out, or humans haven't figured out how to get computers to figure out how to beat human beings at. Which game is that? Leave us with that one fact.
That's right. The card game of bridge has yet to be conquered by computers. It exhibits very human elements, language and communication, and it's an incredibly, incredibly complicated game that computers can't quite top us at yet.
All right. Well, I take a little comfort in that. Oliver, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Oliver Roeder is the author of 7 Games, A Human History. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela. So I have good news, which I know is always fun and surprising when I come on with good news. We got the latest sales figures from the Association of American Publishers this week, and it showed really strong sales for 2021, which was quite encouraging because 2020 was such a good year for publishers. I think people were expecting things to level off, maybe even dip a little bit after people got vaccinated and started going out a little more. Of course, we're still in a pandemic, so things haven't fully been returned to normal on the retail front. But the figures were really strong. It showed that overall sales were up almost 12% for the calendar year. And they were up in pretty much every format except for ebooks. Hardback sales were up 11%. Paperbacks were up 18.8%, which is really quite a big jump. And even mass market, a format that has been struggling for a while, was up a little bit. So in terms of digital formats, ebooks were down almost 5%. And that's not too surprising. They've been falling for several years now, and they did rise during the pandemic when people couldn't get print books because of supply chain issues or because stores were closed. You saw people turning to ebooks. But now people seem to be returning to print more. And so those sales fell. Digital audio was way up, as it has been for almost every quarter, every single year for several years. So digital audio was up 13%. What's interesting to me right now is that people seem to be reading in all kinds of ways. When ebooks were growing really rapidly several years ago, there was this fear that they were cannibalizing print sales. And you did see that to a certain extent. And so publishers were planning on this digital future. With the audiobook boom, it is not cannibalizing print. It seems like either people are listening to more audiobooks and reading more in print. Maybe they're buying their favorite authors in both formats because they like to listen while they're cooking or in the car and then read in print later. So that is a huge, I think, positive development for the industry to see the growth of this format and to see it not only not taking away from print, but maybe bolstering it in some fashion. So the other positive development last year compared to 2020 was that bookstores also had a much better year. After a really devastating 2020, bookstore sales were up in 2021, according to the Census Bureau. So we're seeing some stability. There's still obviously questions about supply chain. That's still a big problem, not just for publishing, but for every retail sector and every industry. There's shipping containers that are stuck in ports full of books that were printed in Asia. And there's still books getting their pub dates moved. There's still issues at printing presses where the capacity is either really, really tight or overstretched. So that's something I think that there's not really a quick solution for, and I'll be interested to see how publishers handle it this year.
And with the bookstores, is that true across independents and chains, especially Barnes & Noble?
Yes. So, we don't have numbers broken out specifically to independents versus chains in the Census Bureau data that was released in January. What it did show was that sales had really rebounded in 2021 after a pretty bad 2020. We've seen from Barnes & Noble statements and earnings reports that they also did much better in 2021 than they did in 2020. And the shifts that we saw during the pandemic to big box stores like Target and Walmart, which increased their market share of book sales, those may have persisted a little bit. It's not clear whether that's eating into sales from other venues like independents, but that's certainly a possibility. And then we have fairly new entrants into the retail ecosystem like bookshop.org, which is positioning itself to be the independent alternative to Amazon. So as we've talked about on the podcast before, you can go on Bookshop and buy a book from them, and some of the money will go to an independent store. You can even select the independent store that you want the money to go to. So there are more options, I think, for people now in terms of how they want to buy books online, as so many people are doing. But it does seem like a really positive trend that these brick and mortar stores that suffered so much during the shutdown and during the pandemic, they are getting some relief, it seems like.
All right. That's a surprising amount of good news, Alexandra. Thank you.
I know. I was really excited to come on and tell you something positive for once. I'm sure I'll have a huge downer next week. So
that's right. Our critics Dwight Garner and Alexandra Jacobs join us now to talk about what they've been reading and reviewing. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Alexandra, let's start with you. What did you review this week?
I reviewed a fascinating new book called The Betrayal of Anne Frank, which is a cold, as its subtitle indicates, is a cold case investigation into the unsolved case of who tipped authorities in Amsterdam to the hiding place of Frank and her family and the other Jews that were hiding with her.
Who's the author?
Rosemary Sullivan, who's a very esteemed biographer and also a poet.
So how did she figure out the answer?
Well, it's interesting. It's definitely not a definitive answer. And there's been a sort of backlash since the review published. Dutch historians and others are saying this is not conclusive, this is circumstantial evidence. But the book doesn't say that it's conclusive. You know, it's applying these new modern methods that weren't available during previous investigations, you know, after the war, applying those methods very intriguingly to narrow down the possibility. It's never been solved, so nobody knows for sure. This is just advancing a new theory that makes a lot of sense. And in the process, recounting very precisely, very carefully a lot of history. I mean, I won't say I enjoyed the book is difficult to say because it's about such harrowing events, but I felt very grateful for the book because it's so rigorous and careful. And I feel like often Anne Frank is made into a sort of symbol of hope or whatever. She's sort of a face of the Holocaust, and it's not fair. It doesn't feel fair to her in a way. It's such a burden on her shoulders. It feels more important to me that we be reminded of the difficult history than sort of look to her as a figure of inspiration.
Who is the person that they claim is the likely suspect? Because it's not a new name.
It's not an entirely new name. It was a Dutch notary, a Jewish Dutch notary named Arnold Vandenberg. And one of the things the book makes clear is that Otto Frank seems to have hinted that he had knowledge of who the betrayer was and wouldn't reveal it. And also that the betrayer had died and Otto knew this. I mean, this is sort of laid out very painstakingly in the book. I'm probably oversimplifying it here. But I think part of the reason there's such backlash is because he was Jewish. That's a very weighty accusation to make. Again, Sullivan lays out very clearly what the motivation would be and just how many Jewish people were acting, I wouldn't even call it collaboratively with the Nazis. You know, they were just trying to save their own hides. So anyway, it's very complicated, but I highly recommend this book. It's a little bit packaged sensationally, but that's just the packaging. The book itself is extraordinarily rigorous, cautious, all those things that historians want.
And you got this book not very long before you had to review it, to put it mildly. Is it hard to do that kind of review, sort of in that feeling of like a vacuum?
In this case, it was difficult, both because the story was difficult. You know, it's not a story, it's history, it's harrowing. It felt very like a very worthwhile undertaking. But I was very nervous about getting something wrong. It's just one of those things where it's so many details in this book. And so to distill those to 1,000 or so words, I was terrified of oversimplification and I was terrified of getting some detail, of misinterpreting some detail of the history.
Dwight, What kind of books make you nervous to review? Or do you not get nervous?
I used to get a lot more nervous than I do now. I think no writer who works for the New York Times likes to get a correction on a story. And I like to say that getting a correction in the New York Times is like getting a traffic ticket because, you don't get one for 3 years. Then all of a sudden it's bang, 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 and you lose all your confidence because something just has changed in the weather. But to be a book critic, I review largely fiction. But as Alexandra well knows, sometimes one week you're reviewing a biography of a great economist, and the next week you're reviewing something about agriculture. And it's always a little bit of slight bit of panic involved. And you just learn to check your facts, I think, very carefully. And there's something enjoyable, too, about being a jack of all trades, about having the topic change week after week. It's also just sort of one of the great ththings about the job.
Right, because you're reviewing work that is about all kinds of subjects, not all of which you have expertise in.
I feel like I'm in college every week.
This week I was in graduate school.
Well, what course did you take this week, Dwight?
From Anne Frank to a novel set in an abandoned pornography store. I reviewed John Darnielle's new novel. John Darnielle, if that name sounds familiar, is the singer-songwriter behind the indie band Mountain Goats, which has been around since about 1995. It's funny, I'm not a big Mountain Goats guy, although you'd think I would. It's one of those, I have this big pile of things that I lump into this folder that I call things that I really should like, but I don't. And the Mountain Goats are slightly in, I don't dislike them. They've just never been a thing for me. But John Darnielle has become a really, really interesting novelist. His career as a fiction writer began in 2008. He wrote, I think some listeners will know, there's this series of small books about individual albums called the 33 1/3 series. And he wrote a book for that series, or just short nonfiction books about specific albums. And he wrote one about this Black Sabbath album. And instead of writing a typical book for that series, he wrote a little novel, a little novella about a young man who was into Black Sabbath. And it really worked. And over the course now of 4 books, he sort of explores these worlds. He's very interested in the alternative cultural universes of sort of science fiction and fantasy and the occult. But his novels don't read like genre fiction. They don't feel like you're reading science fiction or fantasy. They fly very low to the earth. They're very almost Knausgardian in their simplicity, but he's interested in young men and women who are troubled often and have an interest in these genres. So at any rate, that's the prologue to his new book, which is called Devil House, which I think is terrific. It's about this true crime writer who moves into a house in Nowheresville, California, where a horrific crime had occurred 20 years before. And the crime had become wrapped in myth. It happened, there was this abandoned porn store that these teenagers began hanging out in, and they slowly redecorated the place and put pentagrams and cut up all the VHS boxes and made it look really Luciferian. They turned it into this devil house just for fun, for kicks. And then one day the landlord walks in with a prospective buyer, and those 2 people end up getting murdered. And I don't want to say a lot more about what happened in this book because it's really complicated about the nature of storytelling. The author, the true crime writer who moves in, is he has enough sense of ethics and morality to know that what he's doing, and in many of his previous books, is sort of selling people out and exposing things about people's lives that sometimes good people that they might not want to have seen exposed. And anyway, as the book goes on, many other stories are wrapped into it as he tries to explore this story, and it becomes sort of a book about the nature of storytelling and also about true crime.
It sounds kind of cinematic.
I think it could be. It's set in the same small town. I'm going to mispronounce the name because I've never said it out loud. A California town called Milpitas?
Milpitas.
Milpitas, thank you. That's the same town where I don't know if you guys remember the great movie from 1986 called River's Edge.
Oh, yes.
It really, I haven't watched it forever, so I may suck in retrospect. But at the time, I found it very intense. Keanu Reeves is in it, and a lot of other good people. But it's the same town where River's Edge had just occurred, and so the town is kind of on edge. And Darnielle just has a feel. He's one of those writers you just feel like one sentence just bleeds into the next, and he's just a natural. He's pulling from a very deep well. You never get the sense of a writer searching for what comes next or trying to show off. He just tells the story, and it's a complicated one, but he tells it very simply, as if it's the most natural thing in the world.
Let's run down the titles of the books you both wrote about this week. Alexandra?
The Betrayal of Anne Frank, a Cold Case Investigation by Rosemary Sullivan.
And I reviewed Devil House by John Darnielle.
I can find no way of linking those 2 stories, those 2 books. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you both.
Thanks, Bella.
Thanks so much, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.